Good morning everyone and welcome back to another video. So it's been a few weeks since we've done a create with me style video. So I thought we would do a create with me / photography challenge video. So as you can probably tell from the title of today's video, we're going to be doing some food dye and water photography. So a little backstory here. Last Sunday I was feeling this creative itch to just create and just photograph something, and so I was playing around with oil and water photography. And then I had this moment where I thought, you know, what happens if I add food dye to the water? And so I added food dye to the water and this happened, and I was so blown away excited at how cool it looked that I completely switched gears and I started just doing food dye and water photography. But I wanted to take it this week a little step further by adding this photography challenge to really like stretch my own creativity. So what we're gonna do is we'll do the food dye and water photography, but we're gonna add the challenge of one subject 10 different ways. So I'm gonna try and I'll see what I create. I don't have a full sense of what each image is gonna look like. I've got a couple ideas cooking in my head, but we're gonna photograph the food dye and water photography, and then I'm gonna come back, I'm gonna show you the raw images out of camera and then the final post process. So without further ado, let's get into the video. And we're back. So that took a lot longer than I thought it was going to take. Capturing it 10 different ways was just a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. So I was probably at it for like a solid hour, maybe hour and a half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how all of the images ended up. So I'll kind of talk you through a bit of like the thought process that went behind each of the images, but you'll see that the image on the left on the screen is raw and out of camera. And then the image on the right is the final post-process one. So for the first one, it was just a plain vanilla shot of the food dye going into the water. But you can kind of see why I had so much fun with this, because like look at the saturation of the colors, look at the lines and the pattern that is created. Like you can kind of just see why it kind of is a little addicting, because you're constantly trying to see like if you can create like a different pattern in the water or what happens if you do this. So you can just see why, you know, I had a lot of fun with this. For the second one, I wanted to get like really up close to the food dye going into the water, and like so you can't see basically the outline of the glass or the container that the water is in. You just see like the food dye going into the water, creating that pattern, creating that saturation. So this is just like one of them that turned out really good, and so again you can kind of see why I loved this this experiment. For the third one, incorporating foreground blur is such like a classic for me. I love doing this. So what I did is I actually was using 3 glasses and I would just rotate between them so I wasn't constantly running to the sink to get more water or to empty the glass. So I was just rotating between 3 glasses, and what I did is I took 2 of the glasses and I positioned them in front of the third glass so I can kind of create this like dimension and depth, and then I would drop the food dye into the water in the back one, in like the furthest one that was in focus, so you kind of create, so you get this sense of like dimension. For the, is it the fourth? Yeah, so for the fourth photo, I wanted to do one where you only saw half of the glass, so, and really incorporate some negative space. So for this one, I moved the glass so it was pretty much half out of frame, and then you've got all of this negative space to the left, and then I would drop the food dye into the water, again creating all of those pattern and goodness. For the fifth photo, I started incorporating some other like props kind of into the photo, some other elements. So for this one, I grabbed some ice cubes from my freezer and I just put them into the glass, and I placed some food dye onto the ice cubes to see what would happen. I didn't do this the last time I did it. And you know what it kind of reminds me of is, you know, when you see like an overhead shot of like the landscape or something like that, and you've got all of these like creek beds and rivers and creeks that are like kind of conjoining to either a larger river or the ocean, and you've got all of these like lines that are like conjoining. It kind of reminds me of that. So for the sixth photo, I incorporated bubbles into this, and this is another thing that I didn't do last time, but I just took some dish soap that I have, and I just put like 1 to 2 drops of dish soap into the glass. You'll see in the behind the scenes b-roll that I literally took a straw and I blew bubbles into the glass, basically create all of these bubbles that you see in the glass. So it was just another fun thing to do in a different way to photograph the food dye in the water. For the seventh photo, it's just a different perspective on the bubbles in the water. So there was no elegant way of capturing this. So all I did is I took my camera off the tripod and I literally lifted the glass and I just kind of like shot from underneath. And you can kind of see like the distortion that happens because like the glass is like round shaped. So you can kind of see the distortion on the edges and then the bubbles on the top. For the eighth photo, I am still working with bubbles in this one. So what I did is I wanted to get like a kind of like the above the water, below the water shot, and so you can kind of see, you know, the line of which the water sits at, and then you've got all of these bubbles on the top. And so what I did is I just blew some more bubbles, and then I took some extra food dye just to kind of saturate the bubbles a little bit more, and then you can see all of the food dye sinking to the bottom. And like, maybe it's just me, but they kind of remind me, like the food dye at the bottom half of the frame kind of remind me of like jellyfish kind of like swimming. So maybe it's just me, but that's just what it reminds me of. For the ninth photo, I wanted to again incorporate some negative space and then also take a different perspective on like the glass and the food dye in the water. So I kind of changed up the angle of my camera so you only see like the bottom of the glass or the top half of the frame, and then you've got all of this negative space at the bottom, and then I put the food dye into the water so you can kind of see it sink down to the bottom. For my last photo, so this is the last one, what I did is I took 2 of the glasses that I had. One of them had, you know, just plain water in it, and then the other one had, you know, I was using it previously for the photos, so it had all of this green food dye in it already, and I put it side by side so you can kind of see like this is what it looks like before / during, and then this is what it looks like after, and then I just dropped my food dye into the water. Alright, so when it comes to like tips that I've been able to discern from my previous session and this session today is, one, just make sure your glasses are clean. So at the beginning, I kind of just gave all of the glasses a nice little wipe down with a kitchen cloth. You can kind of see that I started getting lazy with it though towards the end, because every time I was refilling the glasses, I wasn't bothering to wipe them dry and then fill it with water. It's more like making sure there's no like fingerprints that you can like noticeably see on your glasses. The second is, if you had a syringe like instrument that you can basically kind of more inject into the water, I think will result in like a bit of a cleaner shot and definitely a different one, because the food dye is coming more as a stream into the water versus I was just using the food dye right out of the package, so it was more like drops going into the water. So if you have a syringe like instrument that you can inject the food dye into the water, definitely give that a try, because I think you'll kind of be able to create a different aesthetic. The third is to make sure you are using a surface that can easily clean up. So the food dye does get everywhere. You can kind of see my hands are all green now. And so luckily the surfaces that I bought off of Amazon, they're a pretty like plasticky material, so it wiped clean really nicely from the food dye. And I was a little nervous about it because I'm using my white marble and I'm using food dye, but honestly, if like I got so much food dye on the white marble and I was able to just like wipe it clean. But just make sure that you are doing it in an area that cleans up nicely. Also, lastly, don't be afraid to experiment. So you can even take it a step further than what I did. I was just using food dye that I had in my kitchen cupboard. It was easy and accessible for me. But you know, you can also try using actual paint. You can incorporate different colors. You can incorporate objects into your water and trying to create these clouds behind it. You can do a lot with it. So just don't be afraid to experiment. So this experiment and challenge, I think, is always good for your creativity. Like I said, it took a lot longer and it was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. You know, 10 doesn't seem like a very large number, so how hard it could be to photograph one subject 10 different ways, but I was actually finding it quite challenging after the fifth photo. After the fifth photo, I was struggling to come up with ideas of like, how can I photograph this one subject differently. So it's a lot harder than you think it is, but I think it did its job when it came to stretching my own creativity. The experiment itself is super easy to do at home, and I think it's actually quite a lot of fun just because it's you're creating these different patterns in the water, and it's a lot cleaner, it's a lot less messier than when I was doing that splash photography a few weeks ago. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget, if you do this at home, please tag Beautifully Wander on Instagram so I can see what you create. If you haven't already, please hit that like button below and subscribe. As well, follow Beautifully Wander on Instagram, and I'll see you in the next video.